So, hello and welcome to tonight's event. Um, my name is Teresa Doherty, and I am the Joint Head of the Royal College of Nursing Library and Archives Service. I'm also the Professional Advisor on the History of Nursing to the College. A very warm welcome to all of you to the Royal College of Nursing for this celebratory event in this, the International Year of the Nurse and Midwife. The RCN is a professional nursing body and trade union, a membership body which represents nursing staff across the UK with about 435,000 members. So tonight you are joining an audience which is made up of nursing staff and members, of other nursing and healthcare staff, of historians, of friends and family, of the public, and indeed of people from around the world. And you're all very, very welcome to join us. This event focuses on the publication of 27 new life stories being added to the Oxford Dictionary of National Biography, or ODNB. To be included, the person has to have made a significant impact on life in the UK. They must be dead and must have sufficient archival evidence from which to write an article. The articles must also have a knowledgeable author who has experience in academic writing. ODNB entries seek to record a life, but also to bring out its significance, its context, and its legacy for the UK and the rest of the world. And this is something that the authors you will hear from tonight are uniquely placed to do, as so many of the authors are both nurses and historians of nursing history. Both the RCN and ODNB are hugely grateful for our authors' commitment to the project, and my thanks go to all of those involved in the project. The project itself began, as so many projects do, as a conversation, this particular one being between our past RCN president, Professor Dame Betty Kershaw, and ODNB's general editor, Sir David Cannondon. They agreed that nurses were underrepresented in the DNB, and they challenged me and the RCN History of Nursing Forum to help fill the gap. The RCN History of Nursing Forum Committee agreed by starting off and creating a list of about 15 key nurses, and they also found authors willing to write those articles. We took these to the ODNB project editor, Mark Curtois, and Mark was not only delighted with the proposal that we put forward, but challenged us to find more. So we reached out to our friends at the UK Association of the History of Nursing, and a beautiful collaborative project was formed. Over the past 2 years, a flurry of research, writing and editing has taken place. It is fitting that the main tranche of articles has been published in 2020, being the International Year of the Nurse and Midwife, and as a reminder of the nurses who came after Nightingale, this year also being 200 years since Nightingale's birth. Talking of anniversary, it's only 101 years since the UK recognised nursing as a profession with the passing of the State Registration of Nursing Act. So it's fitting that these articles represent nurses from the period leading up to and including registration from across the UK who were leaders in their fields and who improved patient care immeasurably. A further smaller tranche of articles is scheduled for publication next year. I've had the privilege of leading this project with the History of Nursing Forum Committee, and one challenge in the project has been to reflect the diversity of the nursing specialisms, from mental health through to nursing research. So much nursing takes place outside of hospital settings, and yet is rarely represented in public discourse. Another challenge was to ensure representation from across the UK. Later tonight, you'll hear a little about Mona Gray, who is the only Northern Ireland nurse represented in the ODNB to date, but we know for certain that she's not the only impactful nurse from Northern Ireland. Another challenge has been to reflect the diversity of the nurses themselves. In light of recent events, it's worth sharing that the articles of the lives of some key Black nurses have long been included in the planning process and are on track for release next year. They say that the more you know how little you know. These 27 articles are a significant contribution to our national memory, but remind us how much more nursing history research needs to be done, and how meaningful it is to share these stories both now and in the future. After the event, you can explore ODNB, which is freely available through most public libraries in the UK and can be accessed remotely using a public library ticket number as a login. So these articles serve to bring the latest nursing research to a wider readership. I want to thank everybody who's been involved in the process for their time, their commitment, and most of all, their knowledge. It is a wonderful testament to nursing legacy that these nurses are now included in our national memory. Moving swiftly on, our speakers will tell us a few tantalising headlines about their nurse. A reminder to our speakers that they are to speak for a maximum of 5 minutes, and will first go to Judith Godden speaking about Lucy Osborne.
So can everyone hear me?
That's
right, Chris? Yeah, great. Greetings from Australia. It's 2:30 in the morning here, so I'll try to stay awake. My hidden nurse is Lucy Osborne. She was known, if at all, as a nurse sent out to Australia by Florence Nightingale. The traditional view was that Nightingale handpicked her to head the team of nurses who arrived in Sydney in 1868. Their task was to establish Nightingale's concept of nursing in Australia. By Lucy Osborne's example, so the tradition went, nurses ceased to be dirty, callous, working-class servants, instead becoming dedicated middle-class professionals. Lucy Osborne was largely depicted as an angelic victim who successfully established Nightingale nursing in Australia. Her success was supposedly despite obstacles ranging from family opposition to hostile doctors. When I started to research her life, I realised how much about her was hidden. The surviving evidence was too often swamped by stereotypes and wishful thinking. A key problem was that the evidence was so patchy. The search for additional evidence took years and eventually led me around the world, helped especially by Lucy Osborne's family and by historians at Leeds. The evidence I gathered blew much of the traditional version of Lucy Osborne completely away. For even her date of birth, so confidently repeated in all the accounts about her, turned out to be incorrect. In place of a predictable stereotype, there emerged a Lucy Osborne who initially made, massive mistakes and who had misled the Nightingale School of Nursing into thinking she was an experienced surgical nurse. The great irony was that she was credited with founding Nightingale nursing in Australia, yet Florence Nightingale disagreed. Nightingale actually refused to have anything more to do with Lucy Osborne after 3 years and spent the rest of her life privately condemning her. My conclusion was that Florence Nightingale was too hasty. Just as the Nightingale School of Nursing at St Thomas's Hospital was a disaster in the early 1870s, so too was Lucy Osborne at Sydney Hospital at the same time. Her disasters were largely due to her inexperience as a nurse and manager, as well as ignorance of colonial culture. But as Lucy Osborne wrote in 1873, when she reached the bottom, she was determined to build up again. Oh dear. And she did so, painstakingly with a new maturity and with crucial political and medical support, creating modern, patient-centred lay nursing in Australia. The aspect of Lucy Osborne that I wished I could have found more evidence about is her nurses and her clinical skills. I know she succeeded because her nurses delivered better clinical care, but the evidence, oh dear, for that is largely negative. That is, she was criticised viciously and extensively, but never for any deficiency in the clinical skills of her nurses. I still find it sad that the register about her trainee nurses record gossipy details about them, but nothing about their clinical skills. So finally, my hope is that Lucy Osborne will now be remembered, not as a stereotype, but as a woman painfully growing into her responsibilities. The quality I most admire is her resilience, her ability to persevere to eventually transform and reform nursing in Australia. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you, Judith. So next up, we have Sarah Cheney speaking about Sarah Elizabeth Wardroper.
Sarah Elizabeth Wardroper was born Sarah Bishop on the 12th of November 1813 in West Burton in Sussex. As a youngster, I discovered that she was reported to have been a witty woman, active in society. In 1840, she married Woodland Wyatt Wardroper, who was a local surgeon, so possibly a friend of her brother, Henry, who was also a surgeon. The marriage would last just 9 years before Woodland died in 1849. So Sarah was then left in financial difficulties. Her father had been declared bankrupt soon after her marriage, and she had 4 children under the age of 10 to support. She needed to find work. So Sarah Wardroper is unusual among the nurses in today's talk because she was not a trained nurse. Despite this, in 1854, she was appointed matron of St Thomas's Hospital in London. In her application, she listed her experience of running a household, as well as medical knowledge learnt from her late husband. Here at St Thomas's, she would remain until her retirement in 1887. At the hospital, she introduced administrative improvements and raised the status of nursing. In 1859, she was recommended by Florence Nightingale to set up and manage the new Nightingale Nursing School, and she became its first superintendent. Nightingale herself visited the school just once, in 1882. It was not hard for me to find information about Wardroper, largely because of her close connection with Florence Nightingale and St Thomas's Hospital, the records of which are in the London Metropolitan Archives. Nightingale even wrote an obituary of her former colleague on her death in 1892, eulogising her achievements. This obituary, however, mentions nothing of the increasingly fractious relationship between the two. Letters exchanged between Nightingale and her cousin Henry Bonham Carter in the 1870s express increasing concerns about Wardroper's abilities and her conduct. She ruled the hospital with a rod of iron, insisting that nurses drop everything and stand immediately if she entered a ward. While this strict manner had impressed Nightingale at first, by 1872 she regarded Wardroper as aggressively authoritarian. Moreover, Wardroper also seemed to be increasingly mixed up and confused, Nightingale reported. An assistant was employed to manage the probationers at the school, much to Sarah Wardroper's annoyance. Now, in my research, I'd have loved to have been able to find out more about what Wardroper herself thought of this situation and of the gradual decline of Florence Nightingale's confidence in her. Most of her letters in the archives are official ones, and the sources that provide snapshots of her personal life and feelings are usually written by others. So, for example, in her diaries, Nightingale nurse Rebecca Strong suggested that personal tragedy had deeply affected Wardroper. She talks of an occasion in 1876 when the matron went to meet the steamer on which her recently married daughter was returning home. However, the daughter had died on the trip, and Wardroper greeted not the daughter, but her coffin. From census records, we can also see that Wardroper's children remained living with her until late in life. Her sons, Walter and Frank, lived at home well into their 30s. Frank helped with the hospital accounts. Walter finally married at the age of 47, shortly before his mother's death. The thing I found most inspiring about Sarah Wardroper was her determination and drive. Many widows in the mid-19th century would be left in dire financial straits, and work for women was scarce and poorly paid. I can only imagine how stressful those few years after Woodland's death must have been, as Sarah sought work and tried to care for her 4 young children. But her management skills seem to have been impressive, and her abilities at St Thomas's were at first widely approved of. It was only in the dual role of matron of the hospital and superintendent of the Nightingale School that things started to go wrong. There was too much work for one person, and even with Frank to help, Wardroper struggled with the accounts. The school suffered as the hospital invariably took priority, and in the records you get a sense of a fiercely proud woman who refused to admit, even to those close to her, that she couldn't cope. This pride and independence might have served Wardroper well after the death of her husband, but by the 1870s it became a problem. However, discovering her personal failings alongside her achievements and abilities really made Sarah Elizabeth Wardroper a fascinating person to research. Her refusal to admit her mistakes made her seem more human, a strong personality echoing through the centuries. I wondered, had it been the early death of her husband and the pressures of making a living that turned someone who'd been described as a witty social young lady into a strict disciplinarian? And how fair was Nightingale's judgment of her? What would Wardroper herself have said in her defence? In all honesty, I think I would have been too scared of her to ask her.
Next up is Alison O'Donnell on Annie Warren Gill.
Thank you. I chose to look at Annie Warren Gill as she was one of the 5 key founder members of the College of Nursing in 1916. Annie was born in Malyu, Isle of Man, on the 25th of May, 1862, to the Reverend Thomas Howard Gill and his wife Isabella. There's not much information on Annie's early life or why, at age 31 in 1893, she chose to commence general nurse training in the Royal Infirmary of Edinburgh, qualifying in 1897. Annie established links with the Red Cross in Edinburgh and in 1900 served in South Africa during the Boer War as matron of the Edinburgh Hospital Detachment. For this work, she was awarded the decoration of the Royal Red Cross in October 1901. She went back to South Africa in late 1901 as matron, serving in one of the concentration camps set up from the conflicts of the Boer War. The photograph that we are looking at here shows her in her tent at the Orange River Colony Camp, and this is taken from her personal photograph album, which is held in the RCN archives. After serving in the Boer War and coming back to the UK, Annie was appointed matron at the Royal Berkshire Hospital in 1903 until 1907. She then took up the position of the Lady Superintendent of Nurses at the Royal Infirmary of Edinburgh, where she remained until 1925. It was relatively easy to find out about Annie in that most of the information on her was held in the archives at RCN Scotland and in the University of Edinburgh, where the old NHS Lothian Health archives are retained. But various newspapers were consulted and the relevant censuses of her time for her birth and death certificates were also looked at. Annie was, I feel, inspiring and a woman ahead of her time. As Lady Superintendent at the Royal Infirmary, she took a keen interest in nurse probationers within the hospital and gave an introductory talk to new students every year. In this address, she inspires them to be the best that they can be, and she describes what she expects aspiring nurses of the future to aim for. She promoted the values and ethics of nursing as a caring profession ahead of before it was even published about ethics of nursing. She suggested that if nursing was to be a profession and not a trade, it must be known by its standards to which you must aspire to. In researching Annie's life, it was surprising to read the early correspondence between her and Sarah Swift as founding members of the college. Although Annie did go on to be a founding member of the college, in fact she was registered number 4, initially she wasn't a keen supporter of it, and Sarah Swift had to persuade her. The other exciting thing for me was that Annie was pivotal in establishing the Scottish board of the college, the first meeting of which took place in Edinburgh on the 1st of November 1916. In exploring Annie, I really would have liked to have come upon any of her early diaries or anything more about her childhood, notebooks about her training, but I'd also really like to know why she chose to train in Edinburgh as from anywhere else in the UK. I feel that Annie should be remembered as a founder member of the College of Nursing, but as well as this, she also worked at an international level in the early 1900s to raise the profile of nursing as a profession long before the college was established. In January 1919, she was also awarded a bar to her Royal Red Cross Medal for her war work. And having realised that there would be a shortage of nurses after the war, Annie proposed in 1922 that married members and probationers be admitted to the college, and this was fairly radical at the time. She also campaigned on the issue of state registration and was a key advocate of it. And in 1920, Annie was elected to the newly formed General Nursing Council of Scotland. She was re-elected to the Council of the College in 1922, and having retired from her position at the Royal Infirmary in 1925, aged 63, she was then President of the College from 1927 to 1928, and then it was Vice President from 1928 to 1930. And finally, in June 1929, she was awarded a CBE for her work in terms of nursing and promoting the profession. Annie died on the 2nd of March 1930, aged 68, at Hove in Sussex, and her funeral took place at the Malyu Church on the Isle of Man, where her father had been the curate in his lifetime on the 7th of March 1930. And a memorial service was conducted on the same day in the chapel of the Royal Infirmary to mirror her funeral in the Isle of Man. Her contribution as a Manx woman was recognised in 2013 when University College Isle of Man named a building after her. In looking at Annie's life, I feel that, as I say, she was a woman ahead of her time, but she was also passionate about nursing as a profession and wanted to progress it. Annie's life was, I feel, a life truly lived and was in the cause of nursing and nursing very early on in terms of the formation of the college. Thank you.
Sue.
Okay, really sorry about that. Don't know what happened there. So let's try again. I started researching Catherine Jane Wood years ago. Hers was a full and complex life dedicated to nursing, and yet she is almost entirely unknown. I first came across Catherine when working on the early history of Great Ormond Street Hospital. Born in 1841, just round the corner from the hospital, Catherine had been a regular visitor since her mid-teens, and in 1863, when hospitals were beginning to recruit lady nurses, video's not on. When hospitals were beginning to recruit lady nurses, she was appointed ward superintendent. Catherine was spotted as having potential by Dr. Charles West, the hospital's founder. They worked closely together, developing West's new ideas about nursing sick children, which put child patients at the front and centre of nurses' role. Catherine implemented his ideas, for instance, urging her nurses that they should be like mothers to their little patients, reinforced by one-to-one nursing schemes which she introduced. She was appointed Lady Superintendent in 1878 and continued to further develop West's ideas about nursing sick children, often in the face of opposition from the hospital's management committee. Her career was sadly cut short in 1888 by the death of her brother, and Catherine reluctantly resigned to take care of her sister-in-law and her large family. This, however, was not the end of Catherine's work, merely the start of a new phase. From 1888, Catherine became a prodigious writer on nursing. Her most influential book, a handbook for the nursing of sick children, received great praise in medical and nursing journals and ran to many editions. Freed from the onerous duties of Lady Superintendent, she also had more time for debates raging on the direction nursing should be taking. She worked closely with Ethel Fenwick to establish the Royal British Nurses Association, with the twin aims of improving nurse education and the establishment of a nurse register. And reflecting her deeply held religious convictions, she became secretary to the Guild of St. Barnabas, an organisation dedicated to supporting the spiritual needs of nurses. Catherine was also on the executive committee of the Workhouse Infirmary Nursing Association, which led to her being commissioned by the British Medical Journal in the early 1890s to undertake a 3-year inquiry into the state of workhouse nursing in England and Ireland. Her findings were published in a series of BMJ articles and were highly influential in subsequent reforms. Researching Catherine has taken me on a whirlwind journey through many archives. It started at Great Ormond Street Archive and then moved to the Church of England archives at Lambeth Palace, the RBNA archives at King's College London, and to the Bodleian Library in Oxford to follow a trail which revealed her great battles with Henry Burdett, a fierce reformer of hospital administration. One of the major disappointments has been my failure so far to locate any of her private papers. Without personal papers, Catherine's private voice remains lost. I know she was passionate about nursing and nurses' welfare, but I don't know her inner thoughts on the major issues which nursing faced during her lifetime. If I have to pick a favourite discovery, I would say it is a photograph of her on an 8-month-long world tour, which she undertook in 1906 on behalf of the Guild of St. Barnabas, and you can see the photograph here. During this mammoth journey, she visited Africa, India, Australia, and New Zealand, among others. And this photograph was taken in Zanzibar and shows Catherine among a group of guild nurses, and she is sitting in the middle next to the priest. What most inspires me about Catherine Wood? I think it's her fearless determination to improve the lot of nurses. Catherine never gave up the fight she picked. Even while making herself unpopular, she stood up for her causes, particularly among male hierarchies she came up against. Henry Burdett hated her. She was regarded as a troublesome woman, and the secretary of Great Ormond Street schemed against her. In an obituary by a friend, she was described as deliberate, downright and outspoken, but also transparently genuine and fearlessly honest in all she said and did. Catherine continued working into her early 80s, when ill health finally forced her retirement. She died a few years later, aged 89. Her legacy spans a variety of areas in the African and nurse welfare. I think the world needs more troublesome women like Catherine Jane Wood. Thank you.
Thank you, Sue. Right, so next we are skipping over that onto Susan Cohen speaking about Christina Tate McKay. Susan.
Hello.
Excellent.
I'd like to introduce you to Christina Tate McKay, seen here in 1916 in her Territorial Force Nursing Service uniform, proudly wearing her Royal Red Cross First Class, awarded for valuable services in connection with the war. Tate, as she was known, was a nurse, midwife, and a Queen's District nurse, and my interest in her was sparked by this image, which I came across in the Queen's Nurses magazine while I was undertaking research for my pictorial history of the district nurse. For me, Tate is important, for she represents a small band of district nurses, members of the Queen Victoria Jubilee Institute for Nurses, established in 1887, who decided not to sign up for active service abroad during the First World War, but whose contribution to nursing on the home front is often overlooked, with the focus nearly always on the army nurses on the Western and Eastern fronts. To the best of my knowledge, Tate never left any diaries or personal papers, so building a picture of her life and nursing career was, like so much historical research, a challenge. The Queen's Roll, the official register of the Institute, was an invaluable resource, for it records each nurse's background, education, training and postings, as well as the superintendent's reports from regular inspections, many of which are very cutting. I do know she came from a large family and was brought up where she was born in 1870 in Lythe Bower, a small hamlet in Caithness, Scotland, where her father was a blacksmith, where she was educated locally and in Edinburgh. And here, the North Highland Archive generously helped from a distance with some family information. Less successful, I'm afraid, was access to the district nursing records in Northumberland and those in Cornwall, as the record office there was in the process of being relocated and we're now in lockdown. Then there were the articles Tate contributed to the Queen's Nurses magazine, which provided fascinating information about her war and peacetime work, much of it which was to do with the welfare of babies and children. What surprised and still intrigues me was what made her decide at the age of 29 in 1899, having apparently spent her time keeping house for the family, to decide to move so far away from her Scottish home to East London to train, initially as a maternity nurse. Her nurse training at Guy's and her Queen's and midwifery training came later, and after several different jobs, she was promoted in 1911 to Superintendent of Cornwall District Nursing Association. But she was already thinking about the possibility of war, for she joined the Territorial Force Nursing Service at the same time. And as soon as war broke out, she was given leave of absence to take up her post as matron of the 4th Southern General Military Hospital in Plymouth, which sounds very grand. In many ways, it was harder for district nurses like Tate to decide to remain at home and to resist the unique opportunity and anticipated excitement of doing their bit for the war effort by going abroad. And it's hard to imagine what a challenge this must have been, organising staff as well as the physical transformation of a requisitioned local school and Baptist church into a fully functional war hospital, ready to admit hundreds of wounded soldiers from the front within days. Post-war, Tate returned to her post in Cornwall, and then in 1921, she abruptly resigned from the Queen's Institute. She didn't give up district nursing, but after some temporary posts, she was appointed Superintendent and Secretary of Northumberland County Nursing Association, and she spent the next 24 years transforming a small cottage organisation into one that served the whole county and for which she was widely acclaimed. So there are lots of unanswered questions, many of which may not be resolved, including why she took up nursing so late, why she cut off all contact with the Queen's Institute, and why she failed to keep her promise to return her Queen's badge, which was a part of her original contract. I did wonder whether the years of war nursing, often under bombardment in Plymouth, had an impact on her mental health. But the final comments in the role talk about her difficult temperament and of her not being in sympathy with the nurses. Whatever the answers, her role as a Queen's nurse, as a Territorial Force Nursing Service matron, and as a district superintendent have earned her a place in the Oxford Dictionary of National Biography.
Lovely, thank you, Susan. And next we have Sarah Rogers, and Sarah's going to be speaking about Annie Sophia Jane Mackintosh.
Thank you. I volunteered to research Annie because I had never heard of her until I started my doctoral studies, despite the fact that I trained at the same hospital many years later. Annie was born in 1871 in Bromyard, Herefordshire. She initially nursed for 2 years in Birkenhead, and then in 1897, aged 26, she started her general nurse training at the London Hospital in Whitechapel in the East End of London. She spent the majority of her 13-year career in the matrons department, including the last 6 months of her 2-year training. During her final 5 years at the London, she was assistant matron to Eva Lucas, who was a fierce critic of nurse registration. In 1910, Annie was appointed matron of St Bartholomew's Hospital in London, which was a very prestigious post. I found the information about Annie mainly at the Royal London Hospital Archives, which holds records from the London where she was a nurse, and also Bart's, and the information was in newsletters and hospital records. I found snippets at the RCN in their online historical journals and in the archive in Edinburgh and in the British Newspaper Archive online. And I obtained biographical information from decennial census returns, the 1939 register, birth and death certificates, and her will. The most surprising and exciting things which I discovered about Annie are that her appointment as matron was very controversial because she'd only had 2 years training at the London, so she was ineligible to apply to Bart's to become a staff nurse because they required 3 years training. But ironically, the Bart's regulations permitted her appointment as a matron. The St Bartholomew's Hospital Management Committee and their League of Nurses were concerned about her appointment because of her inferior certificate of training. Annie was regarded as a protege of Eva Lucas, who was strongly opposed to centralised nurse registration, unlike Lucas's opponent, Mrs Bedford Fenwick, who was a former Bart's matron and a prominent member of the Bart's League of Nurses at that time. Annie received hostility and resentment, including negative comments in some of the nursing press. Her appointment was unsuccessfully challenged, and she considered resigning, but she remained at Bart's until 1927. Annie inspired me because despite the intense focus and ongoing scrutiny, she just calmly got on with her job and slowly implemented changes at Bart's. For example, introducing midwifery training and more formalised training for student nurses, which she gave, or on occasion attended with her knitting. She held her own views. She was assumed to be anti-registration and anti the College of Nursing, like her former matron, but was one of the first to join the College of Nursing in 1916 and was co-opted onto its council and campaigned for legal registration for nurses. Perhaps this is like the Holy Grail for researchers, but I'd really like to find a diary or letters which might reveal more about her opinions about the discussions which almost eclipsed her appointment at Barts. Annie's views on Eva Lucas and Mrs. Fenwick and the nurse registration debate, and what she felt about working at Barts and the London. I believe that Annie should be remembered for her professionalism. Eva Lucas wrote in Annie's reference for Barts that she had never been known to sacrifice principle with a view to securing popularity. And Annie stood firm in the face of vocal criticism to her appointment and throughout her time at Barts. Annie's unexpected resignation from Barts in 1927 was met with dismay, and it was said that she left at the height of her power and popularity, which was well attested by the high esteem in which she is held by all staff. Thank you.
On to Claire Chatterton, who's going to speak with us about Charlotte Seymour Yap. Claire.
Hello, lovely to be with you all and to see friends and colleagues from across the world in the chat box. I'm going to be talking about Charlotte Seymour Yap. She was a nurse who was born in 1879 in Manchester, which is in the northwest of England, not far from where I'm speaking tonight. It was an area of Manchester called Ardwick, and she was the eldest daughter of Moses, who was a railway guard, and Sophia, who was a seamstress. And they went on in total to have 4 children, Charlotte, Annie, George and Lizzie. But sadly, when Charlotte, the eldest, was only 9, her mother died and the family were then split up. She moved to Birmingham, back to her father's hometown, with him and another sister, Annie. George, the brother, went to live with relatives on a farm in Warwickshire, and the baby, Lizzie, was adopted and disappears from the records. Little is known about her early life, but what is known is that she trained as a nurse, qualifying in 1903 in Birmingham at the Aston Union Poor Law Infirmary. She went on to train in midwifery, work as an infant health inspector, and then in a variety of poor law hospitals across Yorkshire and the North East. In 1914, as the First World War was looming, she came to Oldham, or Ashton-under-Lyme, I should say, which is near Oldham, a mill town in Lancashire, still in the northwest of England, not far from Manchester, where she was born. She was to remain there until 1925, when she retired due to ill health, aged 46. She was matron of a hospital called the Lake Hospital, a 300-bed hospital attached to the local workhouse. So how did I find out about Charlotte Seymour Yap? Well, first of all, I must pay tribute to a fellow nurse historian who some of you online will remember, Leslie Wade. Leslie sadly died a few years ago, but Leslie discovered, in a sense, Charlotte Seymour Yap. And when she knew that she was living with a terminal illness, passed on her research notes to me and asked me to continue her work and make sure that she was not forgotten. So it's great pleasure and privilege to present this work, which is very much based on Leslie's early research. I supplemented that by looking in the National Archives, the RCN archives, looking at the census, at birth and death certificates, and in the Poor Law Journal, where she was a prolific writer. So what inspired first Leslie and then me to find out more about this very interesting woman? Well, first of all, she was a prolific author. She wrote extensively. She wrote lecture notes for students. She was passionately interested in student nurses. She edited the nursing section of the Poor Law Officers' Journal. She wrote textbooks based on her notes for students, one on medical surgical nursing and one on children's nursing that was published in 1915. She was one of the very first members of the General Nursing Council, serving on its Caretaker Council, which was the council that was co-opted and then was elected to serve on the General Nursing Council. And it's very clear from correspondence and minutes that she was a very doughty, feisty champion for poor law nursing. And I should explain here that that was the nursing that was done in the institutions that were commonly attached to what were known as workhouses. Low in status, often stigmatized, and often unfavorably compared to the charitable hospitals that had been founded by philanthropists, and which often had better reputations and higher stature, or that was how it was perceived. But Miss Yap fought for the nurses and the patients of poor law hospitals to be remembered, and she fought for better conditions. One of her constant maxims was to say, "Not in the north," when she argued with matrons from southern and sometimes more prestigious hospitals. She was also very committed to improving children's nursing. She wrote some very pioneering words and work. She argued for a better degree of imagination when dealing with children. She queried whether uniforms were appropriate. She championed play and storytelling, and all of this at the turn and in the early years of the 20th century. She was SRN number 6, the 6th person to register as a state registered nurse in England after the passing of the Nurses Registration Act, and she was the 17th member of the college, now Royal College of Nursing. Sadly, though, her later life was blighted by ill health. She had what we now would know to be a condition that could have been alleviated by surgery, but sadly, she had faulty heart valves, and as a result of that became increasingly unwell, hence why she retired at the early age of 46. And sadly, in a letter that she wrote around that time, she said how sad it was for her to be leaving nursing. And she said, "All that I have done will be forgotten." Well, hopefully, by this entry in the National Directory, the Oxford National Dictionary of Biography, and also by the fact that the hospital, which is now on the site of where she worked for so many years, Tameside Hospital, unveiling a blue plaque to her last year, that will not be the case, because she was a pioneering nurse, an author, and a champion for the poor and the needs of sick children. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Claire. Lovely. So we've got Becky Kershaw, who's going to speak to us about Margaret Sparshott and about Lucy Duff Grant.
Thank you very much indeed. Can you hear me?
We can, yes, Becky.
You can. Claire, you forgot to mention my bit about Seymour Yap, that she was the first person to claim travel expenses from the RCN. She's a great favourite of mine for that effort. I wrote about two matrons of the Manchester Royal Infirmary who from 1905 to 1955 ran not only the Manchester Royal Infirmary, but the Territorial Army Nursing Services, which changed its name several times during those 50 years. They were very, very similar in the way they carried out their nursing duties and their nursing professional career. They were both matrons of the hospital. They were both matrons of the Territorial Nursing Services. Sparshott was a founder member and an activist at the RCN. In 1916, she held a very large meeting in Manchester that collected 500 nurses, said to be almost the whole of the population of nursing within the city. And she was an RCN activist responsible for the branch organisation as it was then. Both of them became presidents. Both of them were members of the RCN Council. Both of them became members of the General Nursing Council. Both served on their education committee. Both were examiners, and they were both actively involved in St. John Ambulance. From 1911, Sparshott began to train, with the permission of the medical staff, both the VADs and the Army medical attendants in the outpatient department at the infirmary. And she continued to do that for very many years, even after the First World War had finished. Duff Grant became the president of St. John Ambulance Nurses and their chief nursing officer, something she actually shared, I believe, with other people that we know about within the Royal College of Nursing. They were both decorated by kings, different kings, but both decorated by kings, and both of them had the Royal Red Cross, not once, not twice, but in fact 3 times. The information that I got came from primarily the RCN archives. Thank you very much indeed for sending me a copy of Duff Grant's oral history, and also from the local Territorial Army archive. I used Brockbank's books on Manchester Royal a lot. He had access to the Manchester Royal archives at a time when they were well kept and well maintained. Sadly, they aren't at the moment, and it's very difficult to access them. I also used the local Territorial Army Nursing Archive, which had their medical and their military history within it. And furthermore than that, I found St John Ambulance Archive very helpful. Doesn't have a lot of material, but it did, funnily enough, have what I wanted. I never met Sparshott, of course. She died before I was born, but I did meet Duff Grant. She attended as guest of honour the 75th dinner of the Manchester Royal Infirmary Foundation, the new hospital that is, and the Royal College of Nursing locally was asked to join the event. She was by then quite frail, but I do remember her giving a very stimulating short speech on the value of nursing, which even at the time sounded relevant and very up to date. So what didn't I know about them? Well, Sparshott was born in the Seychelles. That did surprise me. She had a sister 2 years younger than her. Both of them trained at Nottingham. I have often wondered what was special about Nottingham Children's Hospital, because Gordon Fenwick, of course, trained her general nursing at Manchester Royal, but trained at the Nottingham Children's Hospital as well. But curiously also, I found that her brothers went as boarders to the school that I was educated at from being 11 to 18. Her father was a widower by the time that they came back to the Cheshire area when she was 3. He was the chaplain at Cholmondeley Castle. Cholmondeley Castle is a private residence still, not far from here in Cheshire. And my mother born and lived until she was in her 30s at the village under the shadow of Cholmondeley Castle. And I actually knew it well, so I was interested in that too. I found that also when I was really going into Sparshott, that 1907, the new hospital opened in Manchester. Gaskell's daughters, the Gaskells, of course, were great social reformers in the city, but by then were both dead. But Gaskell's daughters lived on one side of the new hospital. The infirmary's mental health unit is still based next to their house. Seymour Yap's parents lived 2 streets away, so close to the hospital, the road they lived on is now the entrance to the car park. Edith Cavell's employers were 2 streets away in 1907 when she worked at the workhouse here in the city. And her next door neighbours, the very next house to the entrance to the Manchester Royal Infirmary, is where the Pankhursts live. So all in all, we were a hotbed of activity. What did I learn of Duff Grant? Well, she was an able linguist. In 1914, she spent her summer holiday in Berlin, and she was the first British woman to go up in a Zeppelin. She was taken up by Count Zeppelin herself. 2 years later, she curtsied. How she managed it, I don't know. She curtsied on the dashboard of the King's car. She became a VAD at St Thomas's Hospital, and she moved into nurse training as a probationer quicker there because they were impressed by her. She attended the King George VI's coronation in uniform, she told us, to save having to make a decision about what to wear. I've assumed it was her military uniform, because she wouldn't have had an outdoor hospital uniform. Like Catherine Jane Wood, she became a president of the Guild of St Barnabas, and she was a very, very, very committed Christian. What would I have liked to have found out more about them? I'd have really liked to know how they influenced RCN councils. I'd have liked to know the decisions they helped make. I'd have liked to know, most of all, what their monthly report to the medical board at the hospital said. Every month for 50 years, these 2 ladies attended medical board. and they presented their report. And all the minutes say is matron's report was received. And I found that the most frustrating thing of all. Why do they deserve recognition? Well, I believe that they deserve recognition for their work on pensions. Sparshott introduced pensions. She introduced pensions for her own nurses. She carried on paying those pensions when the nurses had died, if they died on duty, to their next of kin. I noted particularly when I walked through the hospital the other day that the board in the main old building is still up, and she fought to have nurses who died in the First World War entered onto that board alongside the medical men. That must have taken an awful lot of doing in 1919. So I remember her for that. Duff Grant, well, I remember Duff Grant perhaps most of all for her very committed Christianity. She started every day in prayer in the hospital chapel, and she was a committed Christian who nevertheless, during her time as matron, stopped requiring all nurses to attend chapel, allowing them freedom of their own thought. She also allowed the nurses who were Catholics time off to attend Mass at the local church. So I think that too is worth remembering. They were both committed educationalists, and they both saw the need to look after student nurses. Sparshott erected a new nursing residence, opened only in the early 1930s to allow her to recruit the probationers she needed and to house her sisters and staff nurses better. She died 3 days before it was bombed. Sadly, nobody, of course, we were very lucky, nobody was killed in the bombing, but it did destroy quite a lot of the building that she'd erected and took several years to repair. Duff Grant fought and obtained money for a new nursing school, but she'd long left the building when it finally opened. I suppose I should be thankful. I spent one day as a student nurse in the old nursing school and know full well why she needed the new one that we were privileged to be trained in. So, and indeed, I ended up teaching in. Both of them were very important, very influential, not just locally, but to the profession as a whole. And we think we deserve remembering. Thank you very much.
So next we have Margaret Curry Nielsen Lamb, and speaking to us about her is Kay Wilkie. Kay, are you there?
Margaret Lamb was born in 1906 in Fife, which was one of the reasons that I became interested in her. She was the eldest of what became a family of 7 children, and that put her off marriage. She said, I couldn't be doing with any more children. Her mother didn't keep particularly well, so a lot of the work in organising the family fell on Margaret. Her main interest was in teaching rather than in nursing. However, because she had looked after the family for so long, she was 25 by the time that her mother died. She felt she was too old to go to university. However, somebody had told her about a sister's tutor course, and with a view to becoming a sister tutor, she enrolled at the Dundee Royal Infirmary to undertake her training. She did not enjoy her training. She did not like all of the cleaning, and there were other aspects of it which certainly did not appeal to her. However, she did enjoy working with student nurses and helping them with the theoretical aspects of nursing. After training, she worked in several hospitals across central Scotland. She returned to Dundee Royal Infirmary to undertake her midwifery and ended up at the Southern General Hospital, as it was then, in the School of Nursing, and became later principal of the training school at the Southern General Hospital. She was involved in the Sister Tutors Forum in Glasgow, and in 1946 she joined the RCN as the education officer for the Scottish Board. There's not a lot of information about Margaret from Margaret herself. the RCN archives had an interview of her undertaken for the History of Nursing Society Oral History Project, and that provided a lot of information from her perspective. But apart from that, most of the information about Margaret comes third hand. There's a lot about her, obviously, in the minutes of the RCN Education Board. And the Dictionary of National Biography sent me some certificates, including a passenger list for a transatlantic voyage. Some information from the Scotland's People provided some biographical information about her. When it came to looking at her record as a sister tutor, it was quite difficult. Although both the University of Dundee had information about her training at Dundee Royal Infirmary, when it came to looking at the Southern General Archives, although at the time she worked there, her sister tutors were paid by the NHS, for some reason they weren't recorded on the staff lists. They had the staffing lists for people who worked on the clinical side, but for the training school that seemed to be lost. And neither did they seem to be transferred to the universities who took over training in 1992. So there's a bit of a gap there. Margaret undertook a tremendous amount of work. Her workload was considerable. As well as organising the tutors' courses, she had teaching practice assessments which involved travelling across Scotland. She was a member of the Edinburgh Northern Hospitals Board. She was member and chair of the Nursing and Midwifery Advisory Committee of the Scottish Health Services Council. And she was invited to Burma, Montreal, Germany, Pretoria to give advice on nurse education. She was a very popular speaker for prize givings in nursing schools if you could manage to get a date for it. And she contributed to the reports of the day, Platt, Salmon and Biggs. Wasn't terribly happy about the outcome of most of these, I have to say. In 1948, she became the first Scottish nurse to be awarded a Rockefeller Award. And at that time, she went to Yale and met up with Virginia Henderson, and was absolutely amazed at the amount of work that Virginia Henderson got through, although I don't think she was any slacker herself. As a result of that, the Rockefeller Foundation donated £30,000 over 5 years from 55 to 60 to set up a teaching unit in nursing, which later became the Department of Nursing Studies at the University of Edinburgh. So what inspired me about Margaret was the view that she had of education, about nurse education being more than simply about factual information and about practical tasks. When she taught in the Sister Tutors course, she introduced classical music, she introduced poetry and encouraged discussion about that with an aim to widening perspective of the students and encouraging people to think rather than being on the receiving end. The Sisters Tutors course, the RCN Sisters Tutors course, was set up in 1952 with the medical faculty at the University of Edinburgh, and she had a lot of arguments then with the medical staff as to what was to be involved with this. She was adamant that nursing was a discipline in its own right and that the content of the courses should be decided by nurses, and that they were not there to do as they're told for the medical staff, and that the courses should not be geared to the needs of medical staff, that nursing was very much something in its own right. What surprised me about this was her role in setting up the Department of Nursing Studies at the University of Edinburgh. I was a student there in the 1970s and there was no mention of Margaret at all and her role in this. The 60th anniversary was a couple of years back, and again, nice booklet produced, but again, there is no mention of Margaret Lamb and her work in developing the nursing studies unit. She was a part-time lecturer in the University of Edinburgh, and the RCN and the Rockefeller Foundation were quite keen that she would actually take on the leadership of the department, which she didn't. In some ways she felt that she was too busy to do this, although I think she was a bit disappointed about it. In 1958, she was invited to join the working committee for what was to come, the integrated undergraduate degree programme at the University of Edinburgh. And in the same year, she set up a clinical instructors course, an innovative programme which prepared nurses to teach in the clinical area. She had a view that the clinical staff had enough to do without being expected to teach, which at the time was, I think, quite an interesting concept. And she felt that although you perhaps had this experience, there were additional skills that were needed in order to teach nurses in the clinical area. She continued to remain as a member of the hospital board until she retired. In 1976, she was asked by the government to go to Hong Kong as part of an investigation, so she still continued to work there. Outside work, as you probably guessed, that she enjoyed literature, she enjoyed music, and she enjoyed travel. She had a lot of trips to Italy with her friend. She died in 1991 in Edinburgh. So for me, the surprising thing was her role in the Department of Nursing Studies. And she seems to be somebody who worked very much in the background, but she got things done. That she got on and the work was done and the courses were set up and they ran and they developed. I would like to know more about the early work of the Sisters Tutor course and of the RCN Sister Tutors Forum in Glasgow. And I would just love to have a photograph of her. There are lots of photographs in the RCN archives which shows someone that probably is Lamb, but there is nobody who's been able so far to look at it and say, yes, that was definitely Margaret. But she deserves to be remembered for pushing for changes in nursing education, leading to degree programmes, and also for her perception of nursing as a discipline in its own right, and for nurses to have control over what was taught to nurses and not have that dictated by the medical profession. So, thank you.
Thank you, Kay. Everyone's back. How lovely. It's very prompt, isn't it? So next we've got Margaret Graham speaking about Mona Gray. Margaret.
Good evening all. I'd like to introduce you to Dr. Mona Gray, MBE, OBE, Fellow of the Royal College of Nursing, First Northern Ireland Secretary of the Royal College of Nursing, and First Northern Ireland Chief Nursing Officer, an inspirational nurse leader and playwright who ensured nurses were at the top table of decision-making. Physically, Mona was slim and not particularly tall, but in personality, a dynamo of influence from post-war years here in Northern Ireland up to her death at 98 years. Although Mona made her home here, she was born in 1910 in India to English missionaries. Mona's mother died when she was 6, and along with her older sister, she boarded in a school in the foothills of the Himalayas. Mona was a high achiever, gaining a number of scholarships, which resulted in her becoming a teacher in Lawrence College, a prestigious school near her hometown. With the growth of the independence movement in India, Mona was advised to return to England, where for the convenience of remaining in London, she switched from teaching to train as a nurse at the London Hospital. So in 1933, at the age of 23 years, she entered nursing, where in her oral history freely admitted that being used to colonial life found the practical chores somewhat difficult to adjust to. However, Mona's skills and ability were recognised, resulting in quick promotions through the ranks to become one of the youngest night matrons at the London. She was witness to the hospital being bombed during the London Blitz. Post-war, Mona continued her studies, gaining a hospital training school administration qualification, which resulted in her appointment on the 1st of December 1946 as the first salaried secretary of the Northern Ireland Committee of the Royal College of Nursing. Here, her leadership and drive became very evident. She instigated a wide range of postgraduate certificates, including the establishment of health visitor training. This nurse education really enhanced the skills and knowledge of the local workforce. This nurse training had received time-limited funding from the Nuffield Trust. So to secure permanency, Mona led on a challenging fundraising venture and raised over a 6-year period sufficient funds to buy the current headquarters of the Royal College of Nursing. This was no mean achievement. Mona scripted a series of musicals, including one, A Cavalcade of Nursing, written at the request of the Belfast Festival of Britain Committee. These performances were financially successful. Mona sought support from the movers and shakers of the day, titled gentry, the Northern Ireland Governor, producers and politicians, all bended to Mona's direction, and it is thanks to Mona's vision and determination that the RCN owns its Belfast office. Mona enjoyed challenges, and as Northern Ireland developed its NHS health services, she was appointed our first Chief Nursing Officer. She was also awarded a World Health Organization Fellowship to research nursing administration and community nursing. Her political shrewdness ensured the professional recognition of nursing across the province. Following her retirement in 1975, Mona was awarded a number of honorary doctorates. She was philanthropic, endowing several lectures and prizes here and in England. In her later years, Mona was particularly active in advocating for older people, having the ear of our Minister of Health. Even from her nursing home, she influenced standards set by the Nursing and Midwifery Council. Sadly, I never had the opportunity of meeting Mona. I have been told by several of my senior colleagues that what Mona said, you did. Even if you braced yourself to say no, she had a way of ensuring you said yes. Mona loved history and promoted nursing history. The RCN History of Nursing Network group here in Belfast was established at her request, and it's thanks to her bequest left to the RCN, our network received funding from it to publish Nurses' Voices from the Northern Ireland Troubles, a book documenting the narratives of nurses who worked through the 3 decades of our civil unrest called the Troubles. Mona was benevolent to the end. She died, leaving her body to medical research, and it's buried in a small country graveyard in Cumber, County Down. To me, Mona Gray is an inspiration. Despite losing her family to premature death and returning to England knowing no one, she persevered using her talents for the greater good, promoting nursing and always conscious of the health needs of the local population. She was a teacher, nurse, union leader, civil servant and champion of the elderly, recognised as Northern Ireland's most inspirational and influential nurse leader. Thank you, Mona, for laying the foundation of modern nursing here in Northern Ireland. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you, Margaret. That was really lovely to hear about Mona. And next we have Ruth Northway, and Ruth's going to speak to us about Hilda, or better known as Marjorie Simpson.
Good evening, everybody. Hilda, known as Marjorie Simpson, registered as a nurse in 1937, and she worked initially in ophthalmology services in London before moving to Oxford to train in midwifery. With the outbreak of war in 1939, she became sister in the Queen Alexandra's Imperial Nursing Service Reserve, and she served in both Ireland and France. In her words, she found those postings not too demanding. And at the time, there was a need for industrial, or as we would know them now, occupational health nurses. And so she applied for and was granted leave of absence to go to the RCN to run external industrial nursing courses. She then worked for a couple of years within occupational health settings, and in 1942 applied for the post of tutor at the Royal College of Nursing, and so began 20 years or so of working within the RCM. In 1947, she was seconded to work with Professor Lane in the Nuffield Department of Occupational Health at the University of Manchester. And then on her return to the RCN, she became responsible for the international work of the RCN between 1948 and 1952. It's probably a lot of things that Marjorie Simpson should be and could be remembered for, but I want to focus on her commitment to the development of nursing research. From 1960 to 1963, she was a research officer at the Royal College of Nursing, and she was involved in establishing the RCN Research Discussion Group, which would later become the RCN Research Society as we know it now. And at the time I was asked to research this, I was actually chair of the RCN Research Society, and so having the opportunity to learn a bit more about the origins and some of the early work was a real privilege. In 1963, she left her post at the RCM to become research officer at the Ministry of Health, which was later to become part of the Department of Health and Social Security. And she held that post for 10 years until 1973. A lot of activities which she undertook during that period, both at a UK and also an international level. And one of the things I found really interesting was finding a paper that she'd written for the World Health Organization Expert Committee on Nursing. It was entitled Research for Improvement of Nursing Services, and it was written in 1966. And in this, she argued that there were a number of things that were needed if we were going to actually develop nursing research to be more than just an academic exercise. Things she identified were funding, the preparation of nurses as researchers, publication and dissemination of findings in formats that can easily be utilised by practitioners. And what struck me was that even though we've made a lot of gains in each of those areas, those are still challenges which I think all nurse researchers would recognise today. In terms of what she did that most inspires me, again, there's probably a lot of things that I could have focused on, but one thing I came across was that in 1952, at a time when few nurses had degrees, she took leave of absence from the Royal College of Nursing and commenced studying for a BA in sociology at the London School of Economics and Political Science. She graduated in 1955. And I think what struck me about that was not only did she take leave of absence, but she also chose a subject, namely sociology, at a time when probably sociology was not seen as mainstream within nursing. One of the surprising things that I found when I was doing this research was that while she was working as the nursing or the research officer within the Department of Health, she was still carrying on her studies and was registered to do a PhD. But she had to give up studying for her PhD, as in her words, it wasn't deemed suitable for a nursing officer at the Department of Health to be a student. That fact I got from an oral interview which was undertaken with her in 1968, which is housed in the RCN archives. I was really privileged when I was doing this research to spend a day in the RCN archives in Edinburgh, because Marjorie Simpson had obviously been very meticulous in keeping papers. And I have to say she's probably reinforced in me the bad habit of keeping things just in case. But I was privileged to work through both personal papers, but also she had meticulously kept minutes of meetings, she'd kept records, she'd cut cuttings of things which she'd published. And it was actually amazing to be able to look through that, and also the privilege to read this transcript of an oral interview and to get a sense of her and her character coming through that. Lots of things I would have loved to have found out that I couldn't find out. But I suspect that I probably would only have found some of those things out if I actually met her. And that's something which I would have loved to have done. I'd love to know why she decided to study sociology. I'd love to know what it was that she took from that and then took into her day-to-day work. And I'd love to know more about some of the challenges and struggles which I'm sure she faced in trying to advance nursing research. Thank you.
Thank you, Ruth. Moving swiftly on, we have Julie Bliss, who's going to share the life of Barbara Fawkes, or at least some highlights from Barbara Fawkes' life. Julie.
Barbara Fawkes worked in nursing from 1933 to her retirement in 1974 and beyond in Australia for another 18 months. She trained at the Middlesex Hospital in London, going on to become the principal of the School of Nursing before moving to the General Nursing Council. It was an easy choice for me, a Middlesex nurse, when Teresa asked if I'd be interested in writing a biography for a nurse on the list. Barbara started as a pre-nursing student in 1933 at the Middlesex Convalescent Home in Clacton-on-Sea. The following year, she moved to the Middlesex Hospital to start her 4-year state registration nurse training, described by her in her oral interview as hard but enjoyable. When Barbara started her training, the nurses' home had only been opened for 3 years. She reported that we had very nice rooms, we had swimming baths, which was a great thing, and a tennis court. Despite the hard work of her training, Barbara was able to go to the proms, concerts, and the theatre using 3 theatre tickets. When I started my training at the Middlesex in 1982, I also lived in John Astor House. I suspect it hadn't changed very much since Barbara's time. We still had 2-pin electrical sockets that needed electrician approval. We did enjoy the swimming pool, and we also enjoyed the free tickets collected on the day from the nursing admin offices. Having completed her training, midwifery training, Barbara was moved by matron to the pre-training school, where she taught a variety of topics, including taking students on visits to sewage farms and the dairy, core aspects of public health. Barbara became the principal of the MacDonald Buchanan School of Nursing at the Middlesex Hospital in 1946. She introduced the block system, whereby students spent time in the school learning before attending the ward for a block of time and then returning to the school for consolidation of that learning. A system I can say was still in use in the early 1980s. In August 1952, Barbara sailed to New York on the SS Mauretania. She'd been awarded the Red Cross Scholarship to study at Columbia University. For me, finding out about Barbara was a fairly easy task, as the RCN archives in Edinburgh hold her papers and other archives for her. There was something very magical about seeing these. They included a scrapbook that she'd kept during the trip to America, which had a hand drawing of her room layout in International House where she'd stayed, and the receipt for her tuition fees, £370. As Inspector of Training Schools at the General Nursing Council, Barbara's work included presenting the findings to the inspectors of the Board of Governors of hospitals, resulting in Barbara, in her own words, being welcomed because matron thought that you'd be able to get things for her that she couldn't. As Chief Education Officer at the General Nursing Council, Barbara played a key role in the development of the nursing education for the future. She worked closely with the University of Manchester, who introduced the first degree programme in 1967. Barbara retired from the General Nursing Council in 1974 and was awarded the OBE for her contribution to nurse education in 1975. That wasn't it, however. Since joining the RCN in 1938, Barbara had several roles, including representing the RCN in the work preparing for free movement within the European community. She became a Fellow of the RCN in 1976. She had other roles during her career, including consultancy work for the World Health Organization and work with the International Council of Nurses. Barbara shared a flat with her Australian friend Jean Harris for 20 years. They moved to Australia following Barbara's retirement. They lived there for 15 years before returning to England to live with Barbara's sister. Barbara continued to visit Australia annually after Jean died. It was during a trip to Australia that she became unwell. She returned to the UK, where her health continued to deteriorate, and she died in October 2002. Barbara Fawkes was clearly a woman on a mission, with a vision for how nursing should go forward, much of which we see in the education of nurses today. In 2010, 33 years after the first nursing degree programme, nursing moved to become an all-graduate profession. Her life was certainly an example of, If you want something done, give it to a busy person. Thank you.
Thank you, Julie. And next we have Diane Yarwood, who's going to share with us some thoughts about Juanita Bennett Rule. Diane.
Hello, thank you. Juanita Rule was a nurse educationalist who spent most of her professional life at the Royal College of Nursing. Firstly as a student, then a lecturer, and finally head of the Institute of Advanced Nurse Education, abbreviated to the IANE. The college does seem to like long titles. She was also deputy president of the college in 1976. When researching her life, like others, I was able to draw upon her oral history, which is kept at the RCN archive, along with various other bits of online information, including, of course, obituaries. However, I do also have some personal knowledge, in that I first came across her in the early 1970s when I was doing a clinical teaching course at the RCN and was fascinated by her name. Miss Rule, yes, but Juanita. In those days, we didn't use the first names of teaching staff, especially not the head of the department. So I often wondered why Juanita, and I suspect I now know. Also, was one of those moments of coincidence that I interviewed Mary Good, who'd also been a teacher at the college, and they both referred to the other in their oral histories. They both also went to live in the West Country when they retired, and on retirement, both continued to work in continuing education and hospital administration. So, where did it all begin? The Rule family was living in Mexico, while her father, who was a doctor, was managing the family tin mines. However, her mother returned to England for the birth of Juanita, who was born in Kent in November 1914. So my assumption being that Juanita was inspired by the time the family spent in Mexico. Although she and her mother soon moved to Bath after she was born, and Juanita's remained living in the West Country most of her life. In her oral history, she mentioned that there had been a baby boy born some 8 or 9 years before Juanita, so she described herself as virtually an only child. The Mexican Revolution, World War I, and the death of her father in 1918, when Juanita was only 4, seriously depleted the family's wealth. So having started her schooling in Bath, her godmother offered and was able to pay Juanita's fees to attend a boarding school nearby. But the school did not include science in the curriculum. And so her wish to follow her father's footsteps to study medicine in Edinburgh failed because of her lack of science. So as she said, wanting to do something medical, she began nursing in Weston-super-Mare. But after a short time, she had to return home as her mother was gravely ill. After her mother died in 1935, Juanita began nurse training in Bristol, and she certainly seemed to enjoy her time there. But she wasn't always good with authority. It seemed she kept moving the furniture around in her room in the nurse's home, and matron wanted to know why. She also wasn't very good with timekeeping and often came in late, which again upset the home warden. However, when she finished her training, she became a ward sister in Bath and in Bristol. And enjoyed that, but that she felt she would be better as a ward sister if she took a teaching course. So off she went to the Royal College of Nursing to do the tutor's course. But returning to Bristol, not as a ward sister, but as a nurse tutor. She settled down to that job and got on with it, but after a while, she felt that the matron had too much say in the education of the nurses. So she returned to the RCN, this time to undertake the nursing administration course, which was also sort of referred to as the sisters course. But as she said, they didn't call it that because of the men that were on it, so it was called the administration course. And her aim was to return to Bristol to combine the two roles of education and administration. But the RCN offered her a teaching post in 1948, so she never went back to Bristol. She described the RCN as dignified, relentlessly female and old-fashioned. However, she did stay there working for 28 years. In the 1960s, the RCN was wanting to offer degree courses, and they had government support and were encouraged to develop it. So in order to have a graduate on the teaching staff, Juanita was funded, she wasn't funded, she funded herself to go to Edinburgh for 4 years to study philosophy. She completed her degree, but in the time she was away, the degree plans failed and didn't go ahead, but she still finished her degree and went back to the RCN. In later years, Juanita was quite outspoken about financial constraints and saw government refusal to develop nursing as a graduate profession based solely on finance. What inspired me about Juanita was she was an energetic and early supporter of a graduate nursing profession, and she realised that professional education is a continuum, and that better education at all levels would enhance nursing practice and thereby patient care. She expanded and supported international education during her time at the RCN. She developed a range of education offered by the RCN, was one of the first tranche of RCN fellows, and was awarded an OBE in 1976. At the end of her time before retiring, she was very optimistic about changes in education that were being proposed at that time, even though we had to wait more than 30 years for graduate entry into the profession. Thank you.
Thank you, Diane. That was really interesting and not somebody I knew that much about before this project started.
Good.
Next, we have Stuart Wildman, and Stuart's going to share with us a bit about John Green. Stuart, over to you.
Oh,
thank you very much. Apologies for the lockdown hairdo. Why am I sharing the career and life of John Green with you today? I've written 5 biographies altogether, but I've chosen John Green because he's such an inspirational character, and also because he's the second male nurse in the Oxford Dictionary, Trevor Clay, the former General Secretary of the RCN, being the other. Secondly, John Green was a mental health nurse, and there are few of those in the DNB. And finally, he was part of the Irish diaspora. Irish people have made up a significant proportion of nurses in all specialities in the British Health Service, and their contribution deserves to be recognised. Finding information about John Green was quite easy, as he donated his extensive personal papers to the RCN archives, although there is no recorded interview of him. He was born into a farming family in 1916 in County Clare. At the age of 19, he travelled to England to work as a nurse. In 1940, he joined the Royal Navy, and after gaining his RMN, registered mental nursing qualification, he was posted to a hospital ship in the Indian Ocean. After being demobbed after the war, he gained his state-registered nursing qualification and subsequently went to work at Moorhaven Hospital in Devon, becoming its chief male nurse in 1953. In 1964, he was appointed the chief nurse for Cornwall, with responsibility for both general and psychiatric services. Furthermore, in 1974, he became the chief nursing officer for Gloucestershire. He stayed in post until his retirement in 1978. John Green died on the 1st of May 2001. So what has inspired me most about John Green? In every job and every role that he undertook, he excelled. In the Royal Navy, he rose to the position of petty officer, the highest rank a male nurse could achieve at the time. He worked with men who had fought the Japanese and who were suffering from physical and mental trauma. He was described as having the ability to calm the most disturbed of patients. As chief male nurse at Moorhaven, he pioneered the development of community psychiatric nursing for the first time in the United Kingdom. In the 1960s, he was a member of both the Platt Committee and the Salmon Committee, which looked at nurse education and the senior nursing management in hospitals respectively. He sat on various other committees advising the UK government, and on inquiries into the standards of care in psychiatric hospitals. He also was a leader in the organisations for administrators of nursing and managers of nursing in the UK. He received the OBE for services to nursing in 1973, and in 1977 he became the first mental health nurse to receive a fellowship of the Royal College of Nursing. Such were his achievements that Monica Bailey described him as one of the 6 nurses born in the 20th century who had made the greatest contribution to the care of the sick. So here's a man who's achieved everything. But what was the most surprising thing I discovered about John Green? Could I have the next slide, please, Teresa? He asked Blue Peter, the iconic BBC children's programme, for help. In retirement, John Green took up history as a pursuit, and in particular, he was an active member of the RCN's History of Nursing Society. He published several articles on the history of nursing and a book on hospital tile pictures in children's wards, and you can actually see the page of the book here. And for this to gather all this information, he actually appealed to children for information through the BBC programme Blue Peter, who received apparently a sack full of mail telling them where these tile pictures could be located in various hospitals around the country. What do I wish I'd been able to find out more about? Well, he left extensive diaries and reminiscences about his life, but I think I would have liked to know more about his work with those servicemen who he nursed on that hospital ship between Burma and South Africa, and also his time in Ceylon, where he nursed on shore. But also, 1 or 2 people have alluded to the fact that he had connections with royalty, particularly the Queen Mother. The archives do not contain any reference to this aspect of his life, so I'd be interested to know what sort of connections he really had. So what should John Green be remembered for? It was typical of the modesty and humanity of the man that he spent his last day of employment nursing elderly patients in a hospital in Gloucester. This act brought his career to a full circle. It should be remembered that John Green came from a humble background and dedicated over 40 years of his life to the improvement of care for some of the most vulnerable people in society. He has been described as an inspiration both for leadership and how to influence policy and decision making. Not being a mental health nurse, I had not heard of John Green. Having read so much about him, I think he should be remembered as one of the outstanding nurses of the 20th century. Thank you.
Thank you, Stuart. That's fascinating. And next, we have Jane Brooks, and Jane is going to share with us some thoughts about Elizabeth Hockey. Jane.
Thank you, Teresa and Sarah, and thank you for inviting me to talk today. Elizabeth Hockey, formerly Hochsinger, and I apologise to my German-speaking colleagues for my pronunciation, was born in Graz, Austria on the 17th of October, 1918. She was the second daughter of Anton Hochsinger, a government architect, and his wife, Margaret. She was the second of 2 daughters. Her elder sister was about 10 years older than her, so in fact her parents were quite elderly when they had Elizabeth. And Elizabeth felt that they were overly protective, and it might have been because they were so much older. But she recalled in her oral history, she was not to be held at bay. I was adventurous always, she said. As a young girl, she cycled to the Dolomites without her parents' knowledge. I first met Elizabeth, or I met Elizabeth in 2001 when I interviewed her for my PhD research. Before I met her, I didn't really understand how important she was to the nursing profession, but this changed very quickly, and I soon learned what a profound influence she had had. There is a wealth of information about Elizabeth, not only from her own writings, and obviously the significant obituaries that were written on her death. But most of the information I'm going to give you, I've taken my stuff, my ideas from, comes from her oral histories, that 2 of which exist in the RCN archives. because I have a real passion for personal testimony. In 1936, at the age of 18, Lisbeth Hockey went to the University of Graz to study medicine. Her ambition was to be a general medical practitioner. Her clinical training was hard, and she felt sometimes that the way patients were treated was without real social justice. But she was just really getting to grips with her clinical training when the Anschluss, or annexation by Nazi Germany, occurred in March 1938. Although she'd never considered herself to be Jewish and had not been brought up a Jew, the Nazis delved far into people's pasts, and her Jewish ancestry was found. Her father managed to get Lisbeth out of Austria under the auspices of the Quakers. Her sister escaped later. Lisbeth's parents were murdered by the Nazis. She never saw them again. She started a time in Britain as a governess to one of the Wedgwood family, but she really wanted to return to medicine. Unfortunately, in 1930s Britain, this was not an option. She was a woman, not British, and had no money. So the Wedgwoods recommended nursing to her. In hindsight, in oral histories, she says that she believed nursing is not necessarily a helpful alternative to those who cannot study medicine. But for the profession, her decision to become a nurse was critical. She chose to apply to the London Hospital, and allegedly this is because it had a swimming pool, and was accepted on proviso that she learned English in 3 months. Now, she had been acting as a governess to the Wedgwoods, but clearly her English wasn't quite up to scratch for the hospital matron. But she did duly go away, learn it to the standard that the hospital required in 3 months, and started her nurse training in 1939. She says how much she enjoyed the patient care, and she thought the nursing care was excellent that was offered to patients, but she remained somewhat ambivalent about the teaching, which was often given by the honorary medical staff. She admitted it was little more than diluted medicine. And of course, for somebody who had trained initially as a medical student, this was quite difficult. The war broke out and the London Hospital was evacuated to the coast. As an enemy alien, Lisbeth was prohibited from living near the coast, and she was dismissed, like all other Austrians, Germans and Czechoslovakians. She then entered as a nurse at a fever hospital until she was able to return to her general training at Schroeder's Hospital in Watford, and she gained her registration in June 1945. The moment Lisbeth became an inspiration to me was when she told me of her questions about pressure sores. In her oral history interview, she said, "And I went to the sister one day and said, please explain to me why some of the patients have bed sores and others didn't, seeing as I was interested in the ones that didn't." And she said, "It's not your place to ask questions. Go back and do your work." But then she added, "But if we knew the answer, we wouldn't have any sores." Now, it's that sentence, Jane, she said to me, that got me into research. And it was that desire to know the why and the how that clearly guided Lisbeth's professional life. After her nurse training, she trained as a midwife, district nurse with the Queen's Nursing Institute, and as a health visitor. From the 1940s, she started to meet with other like-minded nurses, including Marjorie Simpson, who we've heard about, Muriel Skeet, and Elsie Ensing. They would meet in each other's houses and talk about questions and think about research. And it was this small group that started to grow that eventually, in my nursing career, became the RCN Research Society. The NHS was founded on the 5th of July 1948, an event which dramatically changed her work and that of other nurses and midwives. Lisbeth had been brought up with a real idea about social justice, felt that this really transformed how she was able to treat her patients. She said, "To be able to help a patient without asking them for money, just wonderful." She was naturalised as a British citizen in the same year. By the early 1960s, Lisbeth was appointed as a tutor to the Queen's Nursing Institute and was asked to consolidate district nurse training. The committee who appointed her planned the syllabus, but Lisbeth came in and asked how they knew the curriculum worked. What we might now say is, how do you know it was fit for purpose? So they sent her to find out. And this survey of DN training was to be Lisbeth's first major piece of research. She studied for her degree in economics as an evening student at the London School of Economics, whilst holding a full-time job with the QNI. And it was at this time she met Margaret Scott Wright, who then herself moved to Edinburgh to take up post as Professor of Nursing at the Nursing Studies Unit. It was from Edinburgh that she headhunted Lisbeth. Lisbeth became the unit's Director of Research in 1971, the first Director of Nursing Research in the UK. She gained her PhD from City University London in 1979 and in the same year was appointed OBE. Of the many other honours she received, in 1982 she was made an Honorary Fellow of the Royal College of General Practitioners, a particularly salient honour since her original ambition had to be a GP. She was awarded the Queen's Nursing Institute Gold Medal of Honour in 2000. She was also named as an Honorary Londoner, London Hospital, despite her dismissal from that hospital during the war. She died in 2004. Lisbeth's most important contribution to my professional life, and that I believe of many others, is her belief that we should always ask questions. Even if the answers evade us, we should never stop asking. Without questions, we don't grow, and the profession would never have developed into what is now a research-minded, evidence-based one. And for that, Lisbeth Hockey, we all thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you, Jane. Our penultimate speaker this evening is Peter Nolan, and Peter is going to speak about Annie Altschul. Peter.
Thank you, Teresa. Annie Altschul knew fear, hardship, loss, and discrimination. But in later life, she did find happiness and fulfillment. Ironically, in escaping Hitler's wrath in Vienna, she became a target of his bombings in London. Whilst in London, she undertook training as a general nurse in Epsom, a time and place she didn't particularly enjoy. She didn't enjoy the way gypsy women were treated by the nurses and their relatives who refused permission to visit. Couldn't wait to leave. On leaving, she commenced psychiatric training at Mill Hill, an adjunct of the Maudsley Hospital. And it was there she saw directly the benefits of kindness. But understanding what it was and the conditions in which it was most effective became her life's ambition. It was there shortly after training she became a sister and then a tutor. And she remained there until 1964, after which she went to Edinburgh. I got to know her by attending conferences, reading her books and papers, and corresponding with her. I was pleased when she agreed to be my external examiner for my PhD. Thinking back on the time I knew her, I was struck by her teaching style, which was always relaxed. She drew people in, invited their contributions. You cannot change things unless you understand how and why they came to be, she used to say. I don't think she was impressed by nurse tutoring she experienced in the 60s and 70s, or she said institutionalized, and it was also institutionalizing. She encouraged students and tutors to question, to research, to write, and to read, to develop self-confidence, to become self-aware, and to have the courage to speak truth to power. She was concerned throughout her life about the thousands of institutionalized patients who lived out their empty, monotonous lives in the soulless backwards of psychiatric hospital. Some, like her, were affected by the war, but in addition, they became victims of the place and culture in which they were supposed to be helped. I cannot help seeing aspects of myself in those patients. She was instrumental in breaking down divisions and inequalities within nursing. She was active in getting male nurses to become members of the RCN, organized conferences and meetings where aspects of psychiatric nursing were discussed and examined. Tutors, students, and nursing personnel were encouraged to participate. She never harbored hatred, anger, or resentment towards the Nazis, though she lost friends and relatives in the Holocaust. She believed through understanding, forgiveness, and love, you could come to see why people behave. They do. Music, reading, playing bridge, and being with friends were her ways of topping up, as she referred to it, as her inner reserves. I would have liked to have talked to her about how she adjusted to being in England and how she overcame her fear, loss, and being a refugee. I would also like to have heard more about her insights into being a psychiatric patient, how she managed her own mental health. I would also like to have known why she thought so many patients who received care didn't improve. In the end, she grew to love Scotland and its people. She became the first professor of psychiatric nursing in the UK in 1976 and gathered around her a group of bright, intelligent nurses who extended and expanded psychiatric nursing literature. She will be remembered for her humanity, humility, and humor, as well as her commitment to the care of those who suffer mental anguish. She died on Christmas Eve 2001, peacefully, at the age of 82. She touched the lives of many, and they in turn touched the lives of many more. She has left a void. May her memory and ideas be long remembered. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that, Peter. That was really heartfelt. And next, our last speaker tonight is Danny Kelly, speaking to us about Robert Tiffany. Danny.
Robert, or Bob Tiffany, is acknowledged as a leading figure in the development of cancer nursing as a recognised specialism. Born in Lancashire and trained as a state-registered nurse at Bury General Hospital. He then moved to the Royal Marsden in 1965 to undertake one of the first UK courses in cancer nursing and worked clinically in operating theatre nursing and as a night charge nurse. In 1969, he took up the post of tutor and in 1970 was appointed Director of Studies by Graham Joyson, the first male Director of Nursing at the Royal Marsden. When Joyson eventually moved on to the Royal Melbourne Hospital, Bob Tiffany was appointed to the post of Chief Nursing Officer in 1976, and then as Director of Patient Services in 1986. From the early 1960s, the Royal Marsden Hospital was based on two sites at Chelsea and Sutton, and he appointed deputies at the Sutton site who he could rely on to deliver his vision. These included Annie Cattell, a radiographer by background, who throughout the 1980s and 90s was a leading figure at the Sutton site. Bob Tiffany had an ebullient personality and never lost his Lancashire accent or sense of humour. Fiercely ambitious, and would always seek out and appoint whoever he saw as the best person for the job, or whoever was likely to have a positive impact on the image and reputation of the hospital. However, if people did not perform as hoped, he would invite them, usually over lunch, to consider moving on. They always seemed to do so. Evidence of his leadership style and ambition emerged early, and the surgeon Eve Wiltshaw notes that as soon as he took over the Chief Nursing Officer role in 1976, at the age of only 34, the number of nursing issues mentioned in the Royal Marsden board meetings rose dramatically. The extent of his influence was felt perhaps most keenly in his promotion of what were then innovative clinical nurse specialist roles by cancer nurses from the mid-1970s onwards. These included a range of diverse specialisms such as intravenous therapy, palliative care, stoma care, community liaison, pediatric oncology, bone marrow transplant, psychological support, and neuro-oncology. These were highly innovative nursing roles designed for clinically expert nurses to work across practice, education, and research. Their high profile soon attracted the attention of visitors from other cancer centres, both nationally and internationally, and they wanted to establish similar roles in their own hospitals. With the benefit of special health authority status from the mid-70s until the mid-2000s, however, the Royal Marsden enjoyed levels of funding not available elsewhere. This meant that many senior nursing appointments would never be possible in other hospitals, leading to some skepticism about whether the Marsden way was really transferable. However, Bob Tiffany was keen to make sure that Marsden nurses felt recognised for their achievements. One example of this was the evening awards dinner given at Alexandra House, one of the nurses' residencies, for those who had successfully completed the English National Board Oncology Nursing Certificate. A celebrity was usually invited to present nurses with their hospital badge and certificate. Myself, I attended such a dinner in 1986, where Viscount Tony Pandy, former Speaker of the House of Commons, and who had himself been treated for throat cancer, made our presentations. Tiffany was also keen to extol the contribution of the ward sister charge nurse and believed that they were key to excellence. He would promote relatively young nurses who he thought had potential, and he would encourage them. Another notable innovation was the appointment of a director of nursing research in the late 1970s. Although not from an academic background himself, this was an unusual step, as university departments of nursing were usually where the small numbers of active nurse researchers and professors were to be found. However, Tiffany knew the importance of research to help raise the status and profile of nursing, and found a way to move from a single director of nursing research to the establishment of an academic nursing unit in 1990. At the same time, the first undergraduate degree in cancer nursing at the hospital was validated by the University of Manchester. He was involved in recruiting initial teaching faculty in 1990-91, which continued to expand throughout the 90s as the Centre for Cancer and Palliative Care Studies in a joint venture with the Institute of Cancer Research. He also established an MSc in Advanced Practice Cancer Nursing at the University of Surrey in 1989, a programme that ran for many years. He contributed further to the emerging cancer nursing knowledge base by editing the first British textbooks on the subject. These were published in 2 volumes in the early 1980s as Oncology for Nurses and Care Professionals, Pathology and Treatment, with Volume 2 covering care and support. Much of the content of these was written by Royal Marsden nurses themselves, but also drew on his extensive professional networks from other professions. He established the Royal Marsden Handbook of Clinical Nursing Policies and Procedures in 1984, a book that found its way onto many hospital wards and is still being updated in printed and other formats to the present day. It's now in its 10th edition. Tiffany was an expert networker, and many of his ideas came from overseas, especially the United States, where innovative nursing roles have been established for much longer than here in the UK. In the late 1970s, he established and joined the board of the International Society for Nurses in Cancer Care. In 1984, he led the development of the European Oncology Nursing Society, which was based in its early days at the Royal Marsden and became the second president between 85 and 87. He was later awarded the Eon's Lifetime Achievement Award. His international contributions included organising the first international conference on cancer nursing in London in 1978, an event that continues to the present day. Other awards include being made Fellow of the Royal College of Nursing in 1982 and OBE in 1987. Bob's influence continues to the day via international conferences and award at the Royal Marsden in his name. But to those nurses involved in cancer care, Bob shaped their career in a way that is still being felt today. More importantly, perhaps, cancer nursing has brought responsive and innovative care approaches to those living with a cancer diagnosis, and Bob's leadership legacy continues in this way on a daily basis. Thank you.
Thank you, Danny, and thank you to everybody who's stuck with us through technical problems, but also through such amazing talks tonight. So I'd like to just briefly thank all of our speakers tonight, and of course the Dictionary of National Biography, the RCN History of Nursing Forum, and indeed the UK Association for the History of Nursing for their support with this project. Please go and have a look at the DNB and find out more about nurses you heard about tonight, but also the other nurses that we added to the DNB as part of this project. Use your local library card to log in to find the full biographies. So I'm going to leave this slide up for a little while, which has some links to the biographies. You can find them, and you can, of course, find out more about the RCN history through our website as well.